Welcome back to the Maybe Yes Sir podcast. Today we welcome Dr. Charles Fitzsimmons, a mental coach with a PhD in sports psychology from Western University. Charles now owns Eclipse Performance, where he coaches a variety of athletes, including some high-level golfers, which we're interested in. Charles is also one of the finest amateur golfers in Canada, a two-time Canadian mid-amateur champ, and next month he'll be going back down to Florida to defend his title at the prestigious Gasparilla Invitational, which I'm excited to hear about. Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Brian, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Just really excited to get to chat with all of you about all this great information, and thanks for such a warm welcome.
Of course. I think this is going to be a really helpful podcast for our listeners. We're going to cover a lot, try to get through a lot today. We'll discuss, as I mentioned, the Gasparilla Invitational and what that is. We'll also help listeners with their mental performance, with managing expectations on the golf course, the recipe, as you call it, what happens when negative thoughts pop up during a round. And I also want to discuss Rory at the 2004 US Open, and then a more recent, I hate to use the term meltdown, but meltdown on the PGA Tour. And at the end, which I'm most excited about is, I think it's hard for people to quantify exactly what mental performance is and how to get better at that. And your partnership, if you will, with Neuropeak Pro, I think does exactly that. So I'm looking forward to talking about that towards the end of the podcast. But first, how did you get into sports psychology, Charles? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, so basically, when I was a teenager, I was getting decently good at golf, but wasn't quite performing the way I wanted to in tournaments. And I was pretty hesitant, just being a teenager, to go and kind of see a mental coach or a sports psychologist about it. But after a couple of kind of really rough tournaments and some frustration, my parents finally kind of convinced me and said, "Hey, just go chat with this guy. No harm if you don't like him." Turns out he was awesome, and really just was able to introduce me to some really important but basic sports like skills that had a huge impact on my game. And I started performing well in tournaments pretty quickly afterwards. So I was just blown away that this whole other side of golf existed, but I had no idea. It kind of felt like magic, but what I know now is it's really just based in a lot of really good science, and they're just skills that you have to develop. And so understanding those skills and being able to practice them and hone them, just the same way you do with the technical skills or the physical skills, is how you get successful. So that was my introduction to it. And then as I was going through school, I was kind of doing my undergrad in clinical psychology, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to go into sports psych or clinical psych or anything that way. And I kind of made this decision that, I want to keep getting better at golf myself. So kind of selfishly, I wanted to do sports psych so I could kind of coach myself. And and just, loved learning about the skills. And for me, I've always said, if you love learning about something, it makes it a lot easier. So
yeah,
it was kind of easy to pursue the master's and the PhD at that point, because I was just learning about how to be a better golfer. And it's just so much fun.
Yeah, I think when I was a teenager, Bob Rotella was like the golf sports psychologist. And I'm sure sports psychology has come a long way since then. And I'm sure a lot of what we're going to discuss today maybe, I don't know, maybe some of it's similar, maybe some of it has progressed, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah.
The Gasparilla, this is such a cool event. And my eyes were... First time I saw this was actually No Laying Up, because Chris Solomon has been invited to that a few times, and they've put out some good content on the Gasparilla. But this is a really cool event. Maybe describe to the listeners what exactly this is, and what this will be your fourth time going down there. Okay.
Yeah, so the Gasparilla has a long history. It actually used to be a pro event way back in the day, and then it became an amateur event. And then I think it was in the 80s or 90s, it was kind of dying out a little bit. And some of the members got together and said, no, this event has too much history. We want to make it great. And so they turned it into a mid-am event and started inviting the best mid-ams in the world, and have really created what is, outside of, say, the US mid-am, the USGA event, probably the best mid-am event in the world, especially mid-am invitational. And they just treat you like absolute
Nice.
kings.
Yeah.
It's just, the club is so welcoming. It's such a cool facility. It's an old Donald Ross course.
Okay.
It's it's landlocked, so it's not super long, but it's like a bowling alley, and the greens are 14, and
Oh,
they've
you're
got those
kidding.
crazy Donald Ross runoffs. So it's just
Yeah.
on paper, it looks like this super easy golf course, and you go and play it and go, wow, this is so tough and so challenging. It's just they take such great care of you and put such on an amazing event for the week that it's just a tournament that will always be on my schedule.
Have you had a chance to prepare it all, other than mentally?
Yeah, not as much as I would like. It's been a busy winter. I'm working with a lot of clients right now, but I'm heading actually down to a training camp with Team Ontario that I'm coaching at this week, tomorrow.
Nice.
And fortunately, when I'm training those high performance golfers, we do a lot of training on the course. So I get to play a little bit and secretly kind of hone my skills a little bit that way, trying to show them a thing or two. I'll get a little bit of prep, but as you said, most of my prep's been kind of mental and physical in terms of trying to keep my body in a decent place, and always making sure I'm keeping my mental skills kind of training in a consistent high level place.
So when you tee it up at the Gasparilla, are you also going to be managing your own expectations during that first round? And that's a topic I do want to discuss because I think it's relevant for all levels of golfers. And maybe you could talk about the 20-60-20 principle, which I think is fascinating and makes a lot of sense. And I think the listeners will really appreciate that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's. I'll take a step back and give you a little bit of context on all of this first, right? So you talked about Bob Rotella, and Rotella would fit into what you might call classic psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, this is what's based around what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's a very well researched, very well proven form of psychology that in sports psychology has also been shown to be very helpful. But it's all about basically controlling your thoughts and your emotions. So it's about kind of, in essence, trying to have more positive thoughts, more confident thoughts, trying to kind of remove some of those unpleasant emotions and some of those kind of negative thoughts so that you can go ahead and perform. And so this kind of managing expectations is a big part of that kind of process. And so one of the things that you do, if you dive into the stats a little bit, you see that golf scores generally follow this kind of somewhat normal distribution in stats. And basically what it just shows is that most people perform around their average, and then it kind of breaks off where they have some bad rounds and some good rounds. And that kind of, when you say that to people, they go, oh, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And so I just put, this is based on standard deviations and stuff like that. And so I just put this easy rule to remember together. It's not perfect from a stats perspective, but the actual stats numbers are strange and hard to remember. So I just called it the 20-60-20 rule, which is basically 60% of the time you're going to kind of play average, 20% of the time you're going to play great, and 20% of the time you're going to play bad. And this kind of works as well for shot dispersion. And so you can kind of go into a round, and Jack Nicklaus used to say this. He said, you're going to hit a whole bunch of average shots, you're going to hit a couple of great shots and a couple of bad shots every round, and the way you go, right? And even people like Matt Kuchar have talked about this, where they said, I think Matt Kuchar said he expects 7 bad shots a round. And so for him, it was just kind of like, and these are approach shots or drives. And so the reason he kind of managed his expectations is when one of those bad shots showed up, he could kind of just check it off and move on.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just like, all right, there's one of my bad ones. So, managing expectations that way from this kind of classic psychology perspective is really, really valuable, because if you have obviously a certain expectation, when it's not met, you have a very strong emotional reaction. And basically, the bigger the gap between what you expected and what's actually happening, the stronger the emotional reaction. And it's that emotional reaction that can really get in our way of if we don't handle it in kind of one way or another. And so obviously the classic sports psych way of looking at this is just to, in essence, manage the expectations to that point so that you never really have that kind of big emotional shock of missing those expectations. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I may be managing my expectations a little bit, just expecting that there's going to be some bad shots and that kind of stuff. But in truth, my personal practice has evolved a little bit more into some newer psychology. It's based more around mindfulness. And so it's not so much about managing expectations or kind of trying to change those thoughts. This new form of psychology is much more about just awareness and acceptance. And so it's not necessarily about trying to eliminate or change those expectations. It's just being aware when they pop up and how they might kind of grab your attention. And so it's just a little bit of a different perspective. And again, I use a little bit of both of the classic and kind of the new psychology. So yeah, going into it, what I always like to say is what I go into is expecting that golf is going to be hard.
Right. Yeah.
And I just know
And
that,
it is.
it's my number one rule with all my golfers: golf is hard. And, you can look at all the different variables that go into it. And it's just one of the most complex games out there. And so being able to just kind of keep in mind that, stuff's going to happen out there and you're going to kind of have to scramble and respond is usually a pretty simple way of setting the expectation that golf is going to happen.
For sure. Yeah. And I think like for me, and nobody cares about my golf game, but for me, the one thing that's helped me over the years, and I don't play that much anymore. So I enjoy every time I go out and play. So my mindset, I think going into it is a lot better than when I was a member at a club for 25 years and I was playing 3 times a week. And also when I was a member at a club playing 3 times a week, for example, I would want to hit that perfect shot all the time because I knew, on the first hole, I had 70 yards into it on Friday, and now I have 85 in. So this shot wasn't good. Then my next shot wasn't as good as I've hit before. And it just keeps on spiraling and spiraling. Whereas now I don't play as much. And like you said, an average shot is a good shot. And you just got to accept it and move on, right?
Yeah, it's again, one of the old school psychology things is being very deliberate with the comparisons you make.
Right.
And, when you make comparisons to a certain level, they're going to make you feel maybe not so great. And if you
Yeah.
make other comparisons, it might make you feel totally different. And in that classic psychology way, you potentially have some control over those comparisons you make. Again, the new school just says, just be aware of them and kind of don't worry about it. But I think, to your point, right, if we can go out there and hit a bunch of average shots and kind of that be our expectation, we are going to get a lot more joy and fulfillment out of it. And if you can remember that, we tend to submit to this kind of anchoring bias in psychology where we kind of pick a number and say everything above that number is bad and everything below that number is good, especially around score. Usually they're round numbers, like say breaking 80 or 90 or 100 or whatever it is. And the truth is, the difference between shooting 89 and 90 and 91 or 79 and 80 and 81 is basically luck. From a statistical perspective, you can't tease out a skill that made that one shot difference. And so it feels good to shoot 79 versus 80, but kind of from a math perspective, it's all the same.
Yeah.
So if we
Because
can,
you can't control a wind gust. You can't control if you hit it into a bunker and it plugs one day and it doesn't the other day. Those types of things you can't control, right? And those are like those little 2-shot swings or 3-shot swings during a round. And like you said, that can't make you happy if it goes one way or mad the other way, right? Golf is such a crazy game that way.
it really is, right? There's so many variables that are not controllable, right? Just one of my favorite ones is called dimple error in putting,
Okay.
which is basically the interaction between the putter face and the dimples on the ball. And that can create these kind of micro errors that are unpredictable and uncontrollable that can be the difference between making a putt and missing a putt.
Yeah.
And, one day you can have a bunch of those line up in your way and you make a bunch of putts and you feel like, the greatest putter of all time. And the next day you have a bunch of those kind of go against you and you miss a bunch of putts and you feel like the worst putter of all time. And the truth is your skill as a putter never really changed that much. And
No.
that's the hard part to kind of keep in mind, because obviously when you see putts going in, you feel good, and you see putts missing, you don't feel good. So it's hard to kind of be like, yeah, I'm the same, even though I have this huge emotional sway.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about controlling negative thoughts or just thoughts in general on the golf course. And you mentioned it with somebody breaking 80 for the first time, or somebody, being in contention at the Gasparilla, and there might be a negative thought that pops up. Something that I've heard you say before is that these thoughts, you can't control them. They're gonna pop up. And that's one thing I think that, again, for me, nobody cares, but my miss was always right. And if there was trouble down the right side, I would think about it. I'm like, I'm already thinking about it. So I'm already, I couldn't get myself out of, I was thinking I should not be thinking about this at all. Like the good players don't think about, the negative stuff, but it's in what you're saying is, no, these thoughts do pop up, but you got to channel them towards, your specific target, for example.
Yeah, so it really comes back to, again, kind of the school of psychology, that kind of classic psychology versus kind of the new school psychology, but how you deal with these thoughts, right? And so the classic psychology would very much label them as negative thoughts, and it would teach you to respond with confidence and optimism. So if you're thinking about hitting the water, just visualize the shot going down the middle, kind of classic stuff that way, right? The challenge with this is, as you saw, is if we become too judgmental about our thoughts, then all of a sudden we can start to have these kind of what might be called meta thoughts or meta emotions, which are thoughts about thoughts or emotions about emotions. And it can really compound. So as you said, you go, oh, like I shouldn't be having this thought. Why am I having this thought? And all of a sudden you start beating yourself up
Right.
for having this thought. And all that does is just further distract you. And if we really go back and understand, what is the purpose of our brain? It's to keep us safe and to keep us alive. Right. And so identifying threats is literally its main job. So it is the most natural, normal thing in the world for it to look out into the environment and say, hey, don't get eaten by that lion. It's the same thing as just saying, don't hit the ball in the water. Right. So to say that these are bad thoughts, yeah, maybe they're unpleasant, maybe they're a little distracting, but they're the most natural thing in the world. And so the new psychology really tries to take a different perspective to say there is no such thing as good or bad thoughts. You actually have to have a second thought to judge the first thought as good or bad.
Right.
It's the same way, there's no good or bad roller coasters. The roller coaster is just a roller coaster. Some people think it's good, some people think it's bad, but that's their kind of judgment of it, right?
Yeah.
And so if you just start to take this kind of mindful approach to your thoughts where you just say, hey, it's normal and natural to have whatever thought. And all I need to really do is not necessarily get rid of that, but just realize when it pops up and how it's kind of grabbing my attention. And then be able to, through my mindfulness practices, things like meditation and stuff like that, basically be able to kind of re-channel my focus back to the shot at hand without having to get rid of or fight that thought. The metaphor that I like to use to describe the difference between kind of the classic psychology and the new psychology is imagining that your mind can text you. And so you've got your phone out there on the tee, and in the old school psychology, you get this text like, hey, dummy, don't hit it right. And you have to text back and kind of be like, no, I got this. I'm a good player. I've worked hard on the range, and I can kind of see the ball flying down the middle. And you have to kind of convince yourself that there's nothing to worry about.
Right.
Right. And so you have to kind of win this argument, and then you can put your phone down and move on. Well, you can imagine if you can't win that argument very effectively and the messages keep popping up in your mind, it's going to be pretty distracting. And so you have to do a lot of practice in the old school to be able to kind of have those one-liners to kind of win the argument versus yourself so you can kind of move on, right? In the new school, basically you just read the message, and like we all do with our cell phones, we read the message and just put our phones away. We just don't respond. And so in that case, you can kind of just put your phone back in your pocket. The message hasn't gone anywhere. You haven't tried to delete it. You haven't tried to get rid of it. You just read it, put it away, back to refocusing on the shot, and away you go. And so it sounds easy. There's a lot of practice that goes into being able to do either set of skill. And so usually when I'm working with clients, yeah, I have my bias towards the new school, but really what I ask them is, what practices are you willing to do? There's some old school exercises that, can be really helpful if you do them for 10 minutes every day, or, are you going to do a 10-minute meditation for every day? It doesn't really matter to me, because if I tell you to do one thing and you don't do it, it's not going to help. So you got to figure out the skills that you're willing to practice on a consistent basis, because those are the ones that are going to help you in that situation.
Is this where Neuropeak Pro comes in with some of the practicing and the mindfulness?
Yeah, so Neuropeak has kind of two levels to it. There's their fundamental level, which is based around breathing, and this is just training that's just fundamental for everybody, because it just basically makes you more efficient as a human. Which, if we want to go into some of the real depth behind it, it just helps you to maintain your ability to handle stress much more effectively. And so if we want to really dive into that, we can, but maybe not at this exact second. But their higher order stuff is what's called neurofeedback training. And neurofeedback training uses an EEG band to basically track your brain waves. And they do an assessment and create a customized kind of training plan to optimize where your brain waves are to basically be able to perform your best. And then you go through and do this training. And the reality is in essence, very fancy meditation. In meditation, you're usually trying to stay focused on something. You're going to lose that focus, and you have to kind of bring it back. Well, doing that is difficult when you're kind of doing it yourself. That's why they have guided meditations to help you kind of remember that it's time to refocus once you've lost focus. But what Neuropeak does so well is their neurofeedback training. Basically, you're engaging with something. So you can be playing a game, you can be watching a video, or for me, I love to listen to like TED Talks and podcasts and stuff like that. And basically, what happens is when you're watching the video, if your brain's in the ideal state, the video plays. As soon as you lose focus, the video turns off.
Interesting. Wow.
And so you get instant feedback about the state of your brain, or basically, in simple terms, whether you're focused or not.
Yeah.
And so rather than having to, in meditation, your mind will wander for, a minute sometimes, especially when you're a young practicer. And then you kind of go, oh no, like I've kind of lost my focus. Okay, now bring it back. And so you've spent a minute kind of off in this other world. But with neurofeedback, you have that instantaneous response where you see that you've lost focus because the video has stopped playing. And so you're just faster to kind of learn that process of refocusing or kind of staying focused. And there's also the reward that's built into it of getting to watch the video, which makes us feel good and probably releases a little bit of dopamine. So basically, it just expedites the learning process of kind of optimizing focus and understanding where focus goes in a very fancy technological way.
Interesting. The recipe, as you call it, where does that tie into all this? And maybe like you could walk through what your recipe looks like on the golf course or over certain shots and how that helps.
Yeah, so the recipe for me is the foundation of everything. And realistically, Brian, this is basically like a pre-shot routine, the way most people would think of it. But the pre-shot routine concept has so many preconceived notions kind of built into it
Yeah.
that I really wanted to shake it up, because when you dive into the psychology, some of the preconceived notions about kind of what a pre-shot routine should be maybe isn't as helpful as it might seem on the surface. And so I'll tell you about some of those in a second. But the idea here is, as we said, golf is hard. And there's a lot of variables that go into it, and it's really complex. And so one of the things we want to do is just develop this really simple recipe to try to hit one good shot and to understand some of the key ingredients that go into that. And again, part of the reason I describe it as a recipe is because everyone's going to have slightly different ingredients. They might have common themes. So you think about like cookies, right? There's always going to be a source of fat. There's always going to be a source of sugar, right? But what fat that is, some people like butter, some people like margarine, some people like oil, what sweetener or what sugar that is, right? Some people might like chocolate chips. Some people might like raisins. Some people might just keep it healthy and put oatmeal in there. And some days they might put different amounts. If I'm making cookies, some days I'm, being very measured with how many chocolate chips I put in there. And some days I'm just firing those chocolate chips in there, right? And so the point of the recipe is it gives you flexibility, where you can say, hey, I don't actually need to do this the exact same way every time. Because one of the biggest challenges is basically if we get too fixated on the recipe, if we get too fixated on our pre-shot routine, it actually distracts us. Because we're going through this checklist of, okay, I did my 2 practice swings. Okay, I did this. Okay, I did that. And that's taking our attention away from what's really important, which is the golf shot. And basically just trying to get the ball in the hole. In the end of the day, golf is pretty straightforward. You're just trying to get a ball in a hole. And so the more we can be focused on, how am I going to get this ball in the hole? Theoretically, the better we're going to do it. And so for me, the recipe is not about kind of what you're doing before. It's about how you're driving your attention into the shot and into the present so that you can be fully engaged in that little moment. And basically, if you can kind of figure out how to do that, and by the way, practice this a lot in practice and in
Yeah.
normal rounds and in tournaments, so you have this great consistency that your brain can latch onto despite all these different contexts, is how you really help to transfer that learning from the range to the course to tournaments, and be able to make it so that when you have those thoughts pop up that are maybe about that other stuff, about whether you're in the lead of the tournament or you're trying to break 80, or you're worried about the water hazard up there or penalty area or whatever it is, what to refocus on.
Right.
Right? That's the key piece, is that you have these really simple ingredients. And I'll tell you my kind of 3 main ingredients in a second here. but you've got these simple key ingredients that you know help you hit good shots and that you can refocus on really simply because you've done it 1,000+ times. And so you can go, okay, yeah, I am feeling really nervous, or yeah, I am kind of fearful of hitting a bad shot, or whatever. Okay, let's come back and just kind of focus on these ingredients. And again, for example, if you're having a swing feel as an ingredient, which we can kind of debate whether it's maybe ideal or not, but let's just say a lot of people like to have a swing feel. And maybe you're trying to kind of engage that swing feel in your pre-shot routine as maybe a part of your practice swing. Well, then, listen, maybe some shots that takes one swing, some shots that takes three. I don't need to make you say you need to only do one practice swing or two practice swings. I want you to activate that feeling because it's that feeling that you're trying to do to hit that good shot.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Right. And so whatever it takes, if you step up to a shot and you don't need to take any practice swings because you've just got that feeling, you have that good feeling in a shot, and step up and do it and go.
You're in the zone. You're flowing, right?
Yeah, just let it go, right? As opposed to being like, oh no, I've got to do my routine this exact same way every time. Whereas on other shots, maybe you're hitting a weird recovery shot and it's not a normal shot, and take a couple extra practice swings and kind of feel it out and really kind of think about what you're kind of trying to do with the ball flight and everything. So I'm sure you're curious what my actual ingredients are with all of that information in there. Yeah. So
yeah, for sure.
For me, I have 3 ingredients. The first one is pick a good target and a shot shape. And so golf is a target sport. And so the more clear we can be on kind of where we want the ball to go, the better. And there's some interesting research about how big this target should be.
Okay.
This is what I refer to as a performance target, by the way, where we want the ball to end up. And there's some cool research coming out of Pinehurst that actually says we want this performance target to be pretty big.
Really?
Yeah. So it goes against the old school idea of kind of aim small, miss small.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so this great researcher who's kind of a legend in the golf psych world or the golf research world named Bob Christina out of Pinehurst did some research on this. And basically what they showed is when people try and aim for too small of a target, they get tense and they actually hit bigger errors. Whereas when you give them a bigger target and just say, hey, just kind of hit it somewhere in there where they feel freer, they actually hit it closer to the center of the target. And it totally makes sense when you think about which hole do you make a freer swing on, the super tight fairway or the super wide fairway?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you can put some math to this, by the way. You can look at your dispersion patterns, if you're using like TrackMan and stuff like that. And you can kind of put this kind of optimal circle out there where you can say, hey, this is my kind of 80% circle where most of my shots are going to fall. And so you feel pretty confident that you can kind of overlay that onto an area and say, okay, this is how I want to do this. And so that is really, really critical because it helps with the decision-making process. You can literally go through and use math and create a game plan for the entire course based on these dispersion circles, on these performance targets, and just put them all in good places. And then you just have to go out there and do it.
Right. Yeah.
The doing it maybe is the hard part, but when you know that your skill level is kind of in that performance target, there's this incredible sense of comfort because you just kind of know, as long as I hit a half decent shot, I'm going to be in an okay place because I've kind of made my game plan based on my skill level.
For sure.
And you go out there and it gives you this wonderful sense of freedom and confidence and focus. And so you can really create a great game plan on that. And then for me, I just try and pick a shot shape of kind of how I want it to go in there because basically if you tell your brain where you want the ball to go and how it's going to get there, it'll kind of figure out what your body needs to do. You think about this in other sports, right? Like you think about a football quarterback on the run, being chased out of the pocket. Like they're not thinking technically. They're just trying to get a ball into the receiver's hands.
Right.
And so the more we can kind of be simply target focused, the more we kind of get out of our own way in terms of kind of overthinking technically. So that's the big kind of main piece. Honestly, that's the most important ingredient of my recipe. I have a secondary piece that's just called confidently committing to the shot, which is basically just saying, hey, make sure that the decision-making is done. Make sure that you're not going, oh, should I hit 6-iron or 7-iron over the ball, right? Like, excuse me. We can talk about why that is, but in essence, your thinking part of your brain or the thinking networks in your brain are different than the muscle activation kind of moving networks of your brain. And so we want to kind of tell the thinking networks, okay, the decision making is done. it's now time to kind of play. And so this process of committing to the shot helps you to say that the thinking about it is kind of done.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so having these clear targets picked out that you can really commit to, it just makes life easier because, again, it tells your brain, okay, the thinking is done. And this goes back to some classic concepts from the Vision 54 coaches, where they
Okay.
talk about the idea that there's a time to think. And so there's kind of a think box in golf behind the ball. And then there's a time to play. And so, for me, this picking your targets and kind of committing to them happens in that think box. And then at that point, you step into what's called the play box and you just play. Or for me, I just say, play like an athlete.
Yep.
And what
Right.
that means is kind of let your body take over. You're not really thinking technically in terms of what you're doing with your swing, because there's some really clear research that if you get too focused on your swing, especially on how your body is moving, it's what's called an internal focus. You actually inhibit your body from moving optimally.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of thinking really technically about, where are my hands or where are my elbows or, how's my hip moving or anything like that, basically you're just getting in your way. And you can imagine, if you're an Olympic sprinter and you're going left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot,
Yeah.
it wouldn't work very well.
No.
Right. And so why do we, just because we have that time to kind of think about that stuff in golf, we think we can do that, but it's actually not helpful. And so the more we can kind of just react to the target and kind of the shot shape that we've picked out and kind of let our body just kind of figure out how to hit that with what's called an external focus, that focus on the target, that's where it shows that people tend to perform their best.
For sure. And I think like drawing your football analogy is a good one because, for example, Andy Reid calls in a play to Patrick Mahomes. They go over the play. Everybody's on the same page. They hit the ball. The play starts and then it's reactionary after that, right? Like things can go wrong and then he's just got to let it go at that point, right?
Yeah, exactly. Got to be able to kind of respond and react to what's going on. And
Yeah.
the more freedom you give your body to do that, because the truth is no two golf swings are the same. Even for the best players in the world, there's minor differences in how they're delivering the club and the muscle patterns and the motor patterns that are delivering that club. And so the more you can give your brain kind of that subconscious freedom to make those little micro adjustments that you could never make consciously because it's too slow of a mechanism, but your brain can learn to kind of coordinate on this kind of system level. There's a great researcher named Rob Gray out of ASU who dives into this in a really fascinating way. So if anybody wants to have their brain blown and just totally throw classic kind of golf coaching out the window, go look up some of Rob Gray's stuff. He's got a cool podcast and some great books that if you want to do things very differently, he'll give you some cool ideas.
Good. Awesome. Hey, I'm curious, can you watch golf without being super critical over like someone's recipe or maybe like even their gait in terms of how they're walking, their mannerisms changing? And for me, I'm, just average guy watching PGA Tour quite a bit, but like one specific tournament that stood out to me was the 2024 US Open. This past US Open at Pinehurst, where it became basically a match play between Rory and Bryson down the stretch. We all know what happened. Rory missed a short putt on 15 and couldn't get up and down on 18. And during all of this, I was noticing that Rory was stopping to watch through the trees at Pinehurst like he can do because of the course, what Bryson was doing and where he was. And I'm like, man, that doesn't seem right. Maybe he has to because he's, trying to manage his way around the course. But it turns out, 2 days later, he was interviewed, and I pulled up a quote from Rory here, and this is what he said, 2 days after the fact. Yeah, thinking back, maybe I was a little too aware of where Bryson was and what he was doing, but it was the nature of the golf course and how the golf course flowed, McIlroy admitted. After the 14th tee, you're sort of looking at the 13th green, and then I had to wait for my tee shot on 15 before he hit, or, to let him hit his second shot into 14. Just the way the course flowed, it just made me very aware of what he was doing at the same time. So it sort of got me out of my own little world a bit. If he was your client, how would you have prepared him for that going into the event? And like, how do you debrief that afterwards?
Yeah. So what we would have started with is an understanding of, again, what kind of school of psychology do we want to dive into? Is it kind of that classic psychology or is it kind of that new school psychology? And in essence, the classic psychology would be much more along the lines of kind of the blinders, right?
Right.
You're
Yeah.
just kind of not really paying attention. You're in your own little world. You've got confidence that if you do that, you're going to kind of end up on top. Maybe you check out the leaderboard every once in a while, but it's really just to kind of let you know, okay, hey, this is kind of where I am. It's all good. And you're just kind of focused in your own little world on what you're doing. Right. And so if we were going that way, obviously we would have worked on just helping Rory to be a little more kind of focused on himself and some of the pieces that way. From the mindfulness, the kind of new wave of psychology, we would say, you know what, trying to control our kind of thoughts that way is just a lot of work. And so it's totally normal. And in fact, it might be helpful to know where your playing competitors are, because, maybe you play a little more aggressive or maybe play a little conservative based on what they're doing, as you say, especially in match play. Like anybody who's played a lot of matches know that the only thing that matters is that you beat the other guy. And so you kind of have to know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Right. If you all of a sudden, if a guy's in trouble and you still go for a par five and then you get into trouble, maybe you've kind of lost an edge there that you didn't need to kind of do. Having an awareness and a reaction to what the other player is doing, I think, is a reasonable thing to do. And so from the mindfulness approach that I would kind of talk about with Rory would be just helping him to realize that he's maybe getting engaged in some of these thoughts and some of the feelings about where he is and what's going on and how much winning or losing means to him. Not to try to change what it means to him, but just to realize how that makes him think and feel in that moment. And in really simple terms, how that takes his attention away from the golf shot. And so we would practice his ability to kind of realize, okay, I'm over here thinking about Bryson and all this stuff's going on. And, I haven't won a major in so long. And that's my career defining kind of, narrative right now and all this kind of stuff. And I'm sure he's having all these thoughts and all of the associated really
For
strong
sure.
emotions as that's going through. And so being able to, kind of notice and mindfully accept those so that when it comes time, he can really dial his focus back into the shot and to his recipe for that shot would be the kind of the way we would do it. Right. And so what my favorite kind of one-liner about this is you have to kind of play the shot, not the situation. This is what I always thought Tiger was so good at back in the day when he was winning everything, was that he'd have a putt to win the US Open, but in his mind, it was a 6-foot right to left putt, right? All the thoughts, all the feelings, all that other stuff about it's to win, all of that was put aside, or at the worst, drove his attention into his recipe to be fully committed to the line, to be clear on what the putt was going to be doing. And for him, he always said he kind of putted to the picture. So to be fully engaged with the picture of the kind of putt that he's trying to roll, right? And so when you become so engrossed in the task, all of those other thoughts and feelings, you almost lose yourself. And what people, maybe learned a little bit about Tiger and some of the documentaries that came out around his scandals was his mental training was occurring from when he was really young. So Tiger was able to do this, not just because he's some special human, but because he's the most mentally trained golfer in history.
Yeah.
Right. He was basically trained by a Navy psychologist in hypnosis, and kind of his mom was a Buddhist, so he was also trained in mindfulness. And those two things together help you to really get in some really cool, like totally engaged, totally present kind of Zen states. And then on top of that, his dad's doing Navy SEALs or Green Beret interrogation training to him. And so his ability to like handle stress and adversity and to be able to come back and totally focus in the moment on his recipe or, on the shot that he's trying to hit was the most practiced of all time. And so, yeah, with Rory, I would try and work on, again, kind of understanding which set of skills, classic psychology or new psychology, he'd be willing to practice on a consistent basis. And then helping him to get better at applying that skill in that moment.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting turn of events, to say the least, at Pinehurst last year.
Well, and listen, if you really dive into the stats, he missed a couple of very makeable putts, but they do tend to miss those putts once in a while. And, somebody like Sean Foley, I remember being on a call with Sean Foley with a group of athletes, and he basically says, you know what, like, people miss putts all the time. And, when they miss a 4-footer on the first hole of the tournament, nobody says that just cost them the tournament. But it's still just a 4-footer that they missed at some point, right?
Yeah.
And we want to create this story to say, oh, Rory must have been nervous and that's why he missed that 4-footer. But a totally reasonable explanation is just that every once in a while he's going to miss a 4-footer, and it just really sucked that he happened to miss a 4-footer on the 18th green. But like Sean would have said, he could have missed that on the first hole of the entire tournament and ended up in the exact same spot, and nobody would have had this narrative that he
Right.
choked.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's sometimes hard to tease apart what is just, in essence, bad timing.
Like variance, as you say, right? Like on average, this is going to happen.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And it's just, was it just the variance of putting that, you're going to miss a 4-footer once in a while and you just happen to miss one at the worst possible time, in a way where our brains come up with this story? Because remember, our brains don't like variance as an explanation. They don't like chance as an explanation, because it just doesn't it doesn't fit with us as humans. We like to tell stories. This caused this, and that makes me feel good because I kind of understand it, and therefore maybe I can do something. And so we very easily fall prey to these associations that our brain makes, that actually, when you look in science, our brain is terrible at making associations. It assumes all kinds of things and creates these relationships that a lot of times when you really study them don't exist. And so it's so easy for us to kind of tell this story of Rory choked and he was nervous and that's why he missed that 4-footer. And by the way, it is totally possible, as we said, that he was too focused on Bryson and what it means to make or miss the putt, and that took his attention away from the line and the speed. That is totally possible. But it's also totally possible that he was perfectly dialed in on the line and the speed and just happened to miss a putt. But again, that narrative doesn't feel as fixable.
Right.
Right. So even Rory wouldn't feel comfortable kind of being like, man, I hit a good putt, I just missed it. Right. Because there's nothing you can do about it. That makes you feel really helpless. Right. As opposed to this idea of, oh, maybe I was distracted. Okay, well, I can work on that and get better. So listen, it's impossible to say. Only Rory would know with some reflection, but even his reflection is going to be biased based on some of these kind of psychological challenges that I'm talking about. So it's sometimes really hard to tease these things apart.
A more recent, I hate to use the term meltdown again, but I have to use it in this case, is William Mao at the Amex 2 weeks ago in Palm Springs. He's par 5 on 16th at the PGA West. Very difficult bunker, obviously, elevated green. He's lying 3 in the bunker and goes on to make 13. So he didn't all of a sudden turn into a 25 handicap in the bunker. And I think it's just an example of like a player spiraling. Whereas, if I'm coaching basketball and I see a team making a run on me, I could call a quick 30-second timeout and stop the momentum and get everybody back on the same track. Whereas in golf, it just seemed like, and in his case, it just spiraled out of control. Like, how do you mentally prepare one of your clients for spotting like the spiral happening and like calling a 30-second timeout, so to speak?
Well, and this is one of the biggest challenges, is because we have this kind of slow play epidemic in golf. As you start hitting these bad shots, you actually feel this pressure from the time to speed up.
Right.
Yeah. And the problem is this feeds very naturally into one of our most evolutionarily ancient coping mechanisms, which is avoidance of discomfort. And so in evolutionary times, discomfort would have been a kind of survival threat. And so our brains are programmed to try to avoid that discomfort at all costs. And it says, if we can't avoid the discomfort outright, if we have to feel it, we're going to feel it for as short of a period of time as possible. So we're going to kind of rush through it.
Okay.
And so this, the classic example is somebody on the first tee who's really nervous. Well, they're not going to just sit there on the first tee and just enjoy those nerves because they're an unpleasant feeling. They're going to try and get that tee shot over with as quickly as possible, right? Sure. There was an example of a player that I was working with, and we had just started working. And I went to a tournament, and he basically had hit his tee shot before the guy had finished announcing it because he was so nervous. He just wanted to get it over with, which was just awesome. And so it's this very natural response that we have to kind of want to get out of uncomfortable situations that leads to this, what's called avoidance rushing. And so when this is compounded with wanting to kind of not be the guy who's slowing up pace of play and everything, you very quickly get into potentially rushing the shot, right? And so your heart rate's up, your emotions
Hmm.
are flowing, and all this stuff is going on. And then you're kind of in this rushing state where you're just kind of trying to get it over with. And it takes you out of just kind of slowing down and really engaging with your recipe, right? And there's also a really insidious part of this, which is when we start to get into some of these high energy, unpleasant emotions. One of the things our brain likes to do is, again, feel more comfortable. And one of the things that we often tend to do, and this is based on what's called reinvestment theory, again, Rob Gray has some great stuff about this, is we want to try and take control of our swing. We feel like if I can make this perfect swing, that I'll get out of this uncomfortable situation because I'll hit a good shot.
Yeah.
But what we know from some of the reinvestment theory research and this kind of internal external research, internal external focus research, is that that internal focus actually impedes performance. But the reason players keep doing it is because it makes them feel better, because it makes them feel like they have a sense of control. And so that sense of control that they feel, okay, if I just focus really hard on my swing, I'll be okay, reduces that discomfort. And it becomes a coping mechanism that their brain really likes. And so all of a sudden you get trained to have this really ineffective coping mechanism of focusing too much on your swing. So you've got this really toxic cocktail of avoidance rushing, over focusing on your technique, and just trying to kind of get it over with because you're worried about timing. And you can see that leads to really good players potentially hitting some really bad shots in a really quick spiral.
Got it.
And
Okay.
so, again, in the new school way of dealing with this would just be to try to become aware of those thoughts and feelings that are coming up in that moment, to be able
Hmm.
to notice. And so in new school psychology, they often refer to this as awareness of your monsters. So we might call this the avoidance monster, where you're trying to avoid discomfort. And so what you want to do is practice identifying those avoidance thoughts and feelings and kind of being able to kind of wave to them and be like, oh, there's my avoidance monster, right? You're not trying to fight it. You're not trying to get rid of it. You're not judging it as a bad thing. You're just saying, hey, this is happening. These are thoughts and feelings that I'm experiencing. Okay, hi, how's it going? And then go back in and just be able to bring your attention fully back into your recipe for that shot, right? And that would be the new school way of dealing with this. And by the way, the old school way would be kind of the Happy Gilmore way of kind of going to your happy place, right? So for William, if he had time as he was walking over there, the old school way would be to kind of realize, oh, this is, I've got this heckler, right? Even though it's an internal heckler, he's got a heckler, and okay, I'm going to visualize my happy place with, my beautiful partner or whatever, and that's going to calm me down, and that's going to slow me down, and now I can go ahead and focus on my recipe, right? So that worked for Happy Gilmore, and again, there's some interesting research on kind of using that kind of happy place imagery that you can look into. So that's the old school way that I would have tried to help William with, but again, the challenge is if you're trying to use this happy place imagery to calm down, and maybe you don't have enough time to calm down, and I'll make a really interesting comment about what happened in TGL the other night.
Hmm.
Maybe you don't have enough time to calm down. If you need to calm down, you can't calm down. All of a sudden, that can make you panic even more as you
Right.
go, oh no, I have to be calm to hit this shot, and I'm not calm. And then you spiral and panic even more. And that's a little bit of the potential downside with the old school. And just to make the comment on TGL, Tiger got the first shot clock
Yeah.
violation of all time in that, right? And there was a great article that came out, and he said, what I was trying to do was before every big putt, I lower my heart rate. So he uses specific breathing and specific techniques that I'm sure he learned as a kid to lower his heart rate. And so there's some great science behind this. And basically what he says is sometimes that takes longer. And so he was waiting for his heart rate to get in that right place.
Right.
And it just took too long in that moment for the 40-second shot clock. And
Oh,
so
I didn't.
again, you can just see that, like, if you feel like, oh, I have to have this low heart rate, you have to be able to control it and get to that place to be able to hit the shot the way you want to. And in Tiger's case, it caused him the shot clock violation.
Wild. This has been terrific, Charles. Thanks so much for your time. I think the listeners really have a lot of takeaways here. If any of the listeners want to get in contact with you, are you accepting clients? Like how do they reach out? What's the process there?
Yeah, so unfortunately, right now my client list is full. I do, clients do cycle over time, where I'll have some clients who are meeting very consistently with me because they're more at the beginning of our work, and then I'll have clients who, I've got pro golfers who I've worked with for years and years and years, but I might talk to them once a month or something like that,
Right.
right? Where they're just
Yeah.
kind of doing little check-ins or talking about kind of things that have popped up. So every couple of months, usually some space opens up in my practice, especially as we switch seasons. So I work with a lot of winter sports as well. Like I work with some hockey players and figure skaters and volleyball groups and stuff like that in the kind of winter. And so, yeah, what I'd say is if people want to get in touch with me, they can shoot me an email to charles@eclipseperformance.ca. And that's the best way to get in touch with me. And basically, if they want to get in touch, I can just put them on a waiting list, and when some space opens up, we can get in touch and start to work together. But yeah, it's I always love chatting with athletes, and so if people have questions or anything, please feel free to reach out, and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible. But
Yeah.
what I always say is just pick one thing that maybe you learned today. I throw a lot of different stuff out there, but hopefully you can maybe pick one thing that you think, hey, that was kind of interesting, and I'm just going to go work on that and go work on it for much longer than you think.
For sure.
It's not a week, it's not 2 weeks. Like work on it for a month and kind of explore some stuff around that. And again, if they're looking for resources in the meantime, if they wanted to work with me, I can recommend some great books to really dive into some things that way.
Great. So you're heading down to Florida next week, you said, or this weekend?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
So just getting everything ready and looking forward to the weather is looking much better than it is here in Toronto right now. It's a little cold and so I'm excited to get down on the course. And actually, this is a really unique training camp that we're at because the kids are playing a tournament down there. And so I get to see them in a tournament under pressure. We get to dive into their thinking and their feelings at different moments and really help them to work on the skills, the mental skills that we've been training and see how they're applying them in kind of a pressure situation. So this is one of my favorite camps that way.
This is the Team Ontario junior team?
This is the Team Ontario junior team, yeah. So we've got the 17 kind of best juniors in the province that we're trying to help develop, to get to the NCAA, to get to Team Canada. Mm-hmm. And they're just an amazing group to work with. And the coaches and the coordinators that I work with there are just amazing. And Golf Ontario really does their best to support us. So it's just overall a program that I'm just always so thrilled to be a part of. To get to help these teenagers develop. Again, I said, sports psychology made such a huge impact on my life as a teenager, and to be able to help these kids dive into that in a really deep and meaningful way is something I just really love to do.
Most recent winner on the Corn Ferry Tour, Sudarshan from Ontario, would he have been part of that Team Ontario junior team when he was coming up, or was he?
I don't think so. I don't think he was on the team when he was coming up. Sudarshan has always kind of taken his own path.
Okay.
And that's what makes him so great.
Yeah.
So I did compete against Sudarshan a bunch. And so it's possible that he was on the team actually before I started coaching it. But, what was so awesome about him is he always knew that he wanted to play pro golf, and he was always willing to put in the work and to kind of do the things that were maybe unorthodox or maybe a little bit different.
Yeah.
But that he believed we're going to get him there. And it's great to see him having that success and getting the win on the Corn Ferry Tour and building that because I know he's put in the work to get there, and I know he's kind of carved his own path. And I just think that sometimes we get so fixated on the idea that there's kind of one perfect path to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've got to have the perfect coach and all that kind of stuff. And the truth is there's a lot of different ways to develop to be a great golfer, and you kind of need to find what works for you and find that path that works for you. And so hopefully you can find some coaches who can help you on that journey. But again, it's really more about you taking ownership for it and you kind of steering the ship, as it were, towards where you want to go.
Yep, agreed. Well, good luck at the Gasparilla. We'll be cheering for you. That'll be fun. That'll be a good one.
Thanks, Brian. It's tough to defend, right? So there's only one spot where you feel good about because it's getting another win. But I'll mindfully deal with all of those thoughts and just try and go out there. My girlfriend's going to come down with me this year and kind of caddy for me. So that'll be cool. That'll be the first time we've done that. So we always have a great time at tournaments. And so it'll just be an awesome week. And I'm just so excited to go back there. Like I said, it's just such a world-class tournament. So no matter
for
where I
sure.
finish, it'll be an awesome week, and
Yeah,
golf will happen one way or another. So I'm looking forward to getting in there and feeling my heart beating again, and feeling some of that competition kind of juices flowing and getting
always
into it.
fun.
So should
Yeah,
be good. So thanks so much for having me on, Brian, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat about sports psych and mental coaching. It's just something I love and I'm very passionate about. So any chance I have to share that with people and hopefully help them out a little bit and make golf maybe a little easier or a little more fun or even help them perform better, just kind of makes my life that much better.
yeah, you definitely did that today. So we'll have to have you back on maybe springtime or summertime. Let's
Yeah,
catch up.
happy to chat and hopefully give your listeners some more information that they can use to, like I said, perform a little better, but also get that greater sense of joy and fulfillment from what they do in their golfing endeavors.
Great. Thanks, Charles. We'll
My
talk to you
pleasure,
soon.
Brian. Thanks.